Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you tonight. Unfortunately, it's a rainy evening in Chapel Hill. Normally, it's very sunny in Chapel Hill, but tonight it's very rainy and the room is almost full. So I'm very impressed that people have ventured out despite the rain. I would like to welcome you tonight to our Ambassadors Forum of the Krasno Global Event series. It is great to see you again for our in-person and our Zoom event here at UNC-Chapel Hill. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been running the Krasno Global Event series since 2012, and we are still going strong, as you can see when you look at this room. The Krasno Global Events brings leading diplomats, scholars, economists, military officers, and many others to campus to enlighten us about some of the most important aspects of our world in turmoil. Tonight, we have a particular special and interesting guest. Our distinguished guest today is the Ambassador of Poland to the United States, Marek Magierowski. I will introduce the ambassador in a minute. But first, I would also like to welcome the ambassador's wife, Anna, and his chief of staff, Maria Makowska. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to the Polish honorary consul in North Carolina, Mark Fountain, as well as to Christian Fossner, the director of the Hans Seidel Foundation in Washington, D.C., and to Klaus Becker, the director of the North Carolina Zeitgeist Foundation in Charlotte. I'm also very pleased, of course, to recognize many of UNC's leading academics who run the University of North Carolina. I'm very pleased that Professor Chris Clements, our Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer, has joined us today. It is wonderful to see Professor Noreen MacDonald, our new Senior Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences. I believe tonight is Noreen's first ever Krasno event. Welcome. And of course, it is great to see Ambassador Barbara Stevenson, who is the Vice Provost of Global Affairs and UNC's Chief Global Officer. Barbara has successfully put UNC on the global map, and most importantly, perhaps, Barbara is a wonderful supporter of the Krasno events. So thank you all for all your support. Before I hand over to the ambassador, let me just say that we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel. It's very famous. If you don't know it, you know what to do before you go to bed tonight. You will watch all our past events. There are actually more than 140 on them, with very distinguished politicians, scholars, diplomats. And after the ambassador's short address, I will ask him a few questions, and then we open it up to questions from you, the audience. Please feel encouraged to ask many questions. Here in the Mandela Auditorium, please raise your hand and one of our excellent Krasno assistants will rush to you with a microphone. If you are following us on Zoom, and I would like to say hello and welcome to our very large international, if not global, Zoom audience. If you are on Zoom, please send us your written questions with the help of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Naturally, we are very pleased that Ambassador Marek Magierowski has come to UNC today. The ambassador has held a very important diplomatic post, and he is also a well-known journalist and politician in Poland. And he speaks an impressive number of multiple languages. Marek Magierowski became Polish ambassador to the United States in November 2021. Prior to this position, he was Poland's ambassador to Israel for 3 years. But initially, for over 20 years, Ambassador Magierowski labored as a reporter, editor, and journalist. Before, in October 2015, he began working for the President of Poland as an expert on public diplomacy. Then, in 2017 and 2018, he served as Undersecretary of State at the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And shortly after he became ambassador to the United States in late 2021, Russia began its war of aggression against Ukraine. Ever since Russia's onslaught, Poland has been at the forefront of both NATO and the EU's policies of great support for Ukraine. In the heated current debate about whether or not the West should deliver main battle tanks and other advanced and sophisticated weaponry to Ukraine, Poland is playing a crucially important role. And as we heard today, it has been decided to send German Leopard 2 battle tanks and American Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine. And I think Poland probably played quite a decisive role in bringing this about. The ambassador's job in Washington has thus even become more important than it would have been in any case. Tonight, Ambassador Magierowski will talk to us about Poland, NATO, and Russia's war on Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming the ambassador to the Krasno Global Event series here at UNC-Chapel Hill.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's raining on my parade tonight. And you know, they always say it's usually sunny here. Wherever I go, to Florida, to Louisiana, it's usually sunny. I don't know what happened. It's rainy today. I don't trust him. Anyway, dear friends, one of my new German friends told me earlier today, you don't need to shy away from criticizing the German government. We are not the German government. But, on the contrary, today I have to, and I do appreciate that encouragement, but today I have to praise the German government for that most timely decision to deliver tanks to Ukraine. They badly needed them, and I do hope that it will be a game changer in this conflict. Distinguished guests, probably we have all asked ourselves the recurring question, why Putin invaded Ukraine in the first place? Did he miscalculate? Was he misled by his own intelligence services about the current state of affairs in Ukraine? Or maybe he just wanted to fulfill his long-standing obsession. And maybe it was one of the first steps, if not the very first step, to reestablish, rebuild the Soviet empire. More than 60 years ago, this is a name you might be familiar with, Nikita Khrushchev, the former Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, paid a visit to Warsaw. And there was a meeting at the Soviet embassy in the Polish capital, during which Mr. Khrushchev delivered a speech in which he said, addressing the United States, the main enemy of Soviet Russia at the time, at the peak of the Cold War, Главный противник in Russian, he said, we will bury you. We will bury you because history is on our side. We will bury you. Fortunately, he miscalculated too. They didn't bury us. History was not on Mr. Khrushchev's side. But this is an indication of how Russian and then, Soviet and then Russian politicians see diplomacy. What the definition of diplomacy is for them. For them, diplomacy has always been a zero-sum game. Someone must win in order for someone else to get crushed irreversibly and painfully. For us, diplomacy has always been a game. You expect your interlocutor, your partner, even your enemy to make some concessions, and you also expect to obtain some concessions yourself. For them, it's something different altogether. It's a zero-sum game. And I believe this is one of the vestiges of Soviet mentality in contemporary Russia that we can see, especially in the ruling elites in the Kremlin. This is how they view diplomacy, and this is how they view international affairs. The very concept of the concert of nations is still very vivid in the mentality of Russian policymakers. It's Russia, it's the United States, it's the UK, it's China, of course, a new player, France, Germany, quite obviously, and that would be it. All the others are simply irrelevant in terms of conducting foreign policy, in terms of establishing an international order, a new security architecture. And that's why, for example, you probably remember that proposal the Russian Federation came up with just a few months before the invasion. Totally absurd. The Russians knew very well that all those demands included in that paper would never be accepted by the Americans, by the West, by NATO. Nevertheless, they did submit the document officially, because for them, it's a zero-sum game. It was not intended for negotiation. It was intended for being rejected by the West. And it was, of course, a kind of a justification, or one of many justifications Putin then used trying to justify his decision to invade Ukraine. Another one, that recurring narrative of encirclement. Since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Putin has always been using this argument. By the way, it was him who defined the dissolution of his former homeland as the greatest calamity in the 20th century, which is tremendously abhorrent from our point of view. Poles, the Baltics, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Romanians. And for example, when you see all those red banners with the hammer and the sickle during the victory parades on the Red Square in Moscow every year, we are horrified. How is it possible that those people use those symbols of repression and brutality, dictatorship today? For us, for Poles, for the Czechs, for the Hungarians, that symbol is equivalent with the Nazi swastika. And it's even more horrendous when we see people, young people, teenagers in Western countries wearing T-shirts with the very same emblem. The narrative of encirclement. We are encircled by NATO. Just look at the map. NATO is expanding. So many countries joined NATO after 1989. We feel betrayed because President Yeltsin and the American officials agreed on the decision not to expand NATO, which is not exactly true, of course, but this is one of those elements that Putin bases his narrative on. We are encircled. But he tends to forget that it was us, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999, which wanted to be admitted into NATO. Nobody dragged us into that organization against our will. It was our own will to join NATO because we felt endangered. We felt threatened by Russia at the time. We wanted to be part of the West. That had always been our aspiration and our ambition, to join NATO and to join the European Union. The Americans did not trick us into joining those organizations. And Putin knows that very well. And he uses that argument very cynically. In July last year, President Putin wrote and published an essay about the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine, claiming that Ukraine is not even a nation. They don't even have their own language. They don't even have their own culture. Ukraine basically does not exist. It's mirage. It's just a figment of imagination. because Ukraine has always been Russian. The cradle, Kiev, is not the cradle of the Ukrainian civilization, it's the cradle of the Russian civilization, which is partially true, of course. But he dismissed Ukraine and the Ukrainians as a state and a nation. Again, he miscalculated. And he was absolutely sure, and maybe he was also misled by, as I said, by his intelligence services, that the Ukrainians, especially in the eastern part of that country, would welcome and greet Russian troops with garlands as liberators. And the FSB did bombard Putin with reports about the miserable state of the Ukrainian economy, messy politics, declining approval ratings of President Zelensky, and the general, whirlwind of political machinations in that country, which would eventually lead to frustration among the Ukrainian population. And that would be the right moment to invade Ukraine, to liberate Ukraine. He did believe genuinely in that scenario. He miscalculated because he didn't realize how proud Ukrainians were of their own nationhood, of their own culture, and of their own language. I believe he had the impression that both Russians and Ukrainians still lived in the 90s. But it's been more than 30 years, actually, since the Soviet Union collapsed. Many things have changed, also in the Ukrainian mindset. And quite paradoxically, what Putin has achieved since he gave the order to invade Ukraine was the strengthening of the Ukrainian national identity. He reinforced NATO. He reinvigorated the European Union's foreign policy. And he has basically enlarged NATO by himself, with Sweden and Finland about to join this organization shortly, hopefully. For Putin, it was quite natural that Ukraine was part of Russia. And he knew also that he could not afford to lose Ukraine to the West. Because for Putin, the primary fear is Ukraine not joining NATO and encircling the Russian underbelly. It's Ukraine joining the European Union and becoming wealthier, more prosperous, more democratic, more liberal economically, and less corrupt. That's his primal fear. If you want to see the beginning of the end of Putin's rule in Russia, you don't need to look at Moscow and St. Petersburg, at other major urban centers in Russia. There will be no mass protests against the war. There will be no demonstrations against Putin's rule, at least in the foreseeable future. You need to look at countries like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Uzbekistan, and some Russian provinces like Chechnya. Once they decouple themselves, both politically and economically, from Russia, and we can now see some very interesting phenomena in this respect, especially in Kazakhstan. Once they distance themselves from Russia, both politically and economically, that would be the end, the beginning of the end of Putin's power in the Kremlin. Because that sphere of influence is one of the pillars of the Russian foreign policy. The post-Soviet republics, and I keep my fingers crossed for them to decouple themselves from Russia, finally. The Ukrainians have demonstrated quite clearly and consistently that they are more European than Russians. They are even more European than many other European nations right now. It's incredible to see, for example, the Ukrainian and the EU flags combined in so many places in Ukraine. They do believe that it is a dream that might come true pretty shortly. And of course, Poland is advocating for Ukraine to join the European Union as quickly as possible. Also NATO, which will be much more complicated, of course, and it will probably meet with much more robust resistance also among some of our European partners. Still, I believe that Ukraine is on the right path to join the European Union and to be our steadfast ally in the years to come. Poland, as you know, has played an important role in this conflict in various dimensions. One of them is the social crisis. We have admitted more than, well, between 8 and 9 million Ukrainian refugees have crossed the border since the beginning of the hostilities in Ukraine. Some of them re-emigrated to other countries in Europe. Some of them have returned to Ukraine, especially after the situation stabilized a little bit in the western part of that country. But roughly 1.5 million refugees did remain in Poland. And we should add this number to also approximately 1.5 million economic migrants who had lived and worked in Poland before the war. There were subsequent waves of migrants arriving in Poland even before Putin invaded Ukraine. So Poland's population has essentially increased by about 3 million people over the last couple of years. So the Ukrainians now amount to about 7 to 8% of our overall population, which is enriching, which is good, which is positive, especially for our economy. This is well, two facets of the same issue. Firstly, our unemployment rate is now ridiculously low, between 3 and 4%. So we were capable, even physically, of absorbing those migrants, those refugees, into the Polish labor market. Secondly, the Polish economy has been doing pretty well, even during the pandemic. I'm not saying that we have not suffered at all, but especially if you compare our economic indicators over the last couple of years, since the beginning of the pandemic, they are much better than in other European countries. So that was the right window of opportunity also for us to take in so many millions of Ukrainian refugees. And they, believe me, they integrate into the Polish society seamlessly, perfectly. They learn the language in a matter of months, also because these two languages are so similar to each other. They have similar cultural and religious background, which is all of fundamental importance in terms of integration or assimilation. Finally, about 95% of those refugees are women and children, because we all know what the Ukrainian men are doing right now. And those women, upon arrival in Poland, they never say, I want welfare. I want an allowance. They always say, I want a job. And they get a job. But we don't give them fish. We give them a fishing rod. Because we know very well that in order for them to advance, we just cannot, and we are not, as a country, we're not as wealthy as Germany, France, or Sweden. We can't afford to sustain all those families financially and endlessly. So we prefer a different model. We give them a fishing rod. We give them a job. And they appreciate that. It's a completely different picture in terms of approach to migration across various European countries. Just a month or less than a month after the beginning of the war, the Polish parliament passed a law which essentially facilitates the Ukrainian refugees' integration into the Polish society. They can apply for Polish ID, which does not automatically make them Polish citizens, but with that ID, they can set up their own businesses, they can send their children to Polish schools. We have incorporated more than 200,000 Ukrainian kids into the Polish schooling system. They are also eligible for free healthcare. They got vaccinated. It was a real and a serious issue because many of those people arrived in Poland unvaccinated. And I'm not talking only about COVID. I'm talking also about other infectious diseases like measles. It was a serious problem for the Polish healthcare system. But we sorted it out somehow. It's still a burden for us. We have to be realistic and pragmatic about Poland's ability to absorb further waves of migrants, but and of course, according to some sociologists, there was fear, there was genuine concern that the public mood would eventually change, and that many Poles would not be very happy about the presence of so many Ukrainian refugees on Polish soil. But thankfully, it hasn't changed yet. According to a recent poll, about 86% of Polish citizens have been somehow involved in assistance to Ukrainians, hosting Ukrainian families in their homes, donating items to charities, or sending stuff to Ukraine. 86%. And of course, as you can imagine, Ukraine is now the most popular country in Poland and vice versa. Do you know who is the most popular politician in Ukraine among foreign leaders? President Duda, of course, a very good friend of Mr. Zelensky, who had never had any doubts about what course of action Poland should take in this conflict. I'm talking about a social dimension, but of course there are many other ramifications of this war. A new realignment within the European Union and NATO, which has its upsides and its downsides, because as I said, Putin has unintentionally reinvigorated NATO and strengthened its cohesion. But on the other hand, I believe there are some countries in the West which understand Russia, contemporary Russia, and Russia's history and Russia's mentality much better than others. And I mean Poland, our Central European neighbors, the Baltics, the Scandinavians, and the Anglo-Saxons, not only Americans and Britons, but also Australians, Canadians, New Zealand. So there are cracks and fissures in our apparently common approach to Russia. I do believe that we can also overcome this obstacle, also because all masks are now off. Everybody now can see in plain view what contemporary Russia really is. And I wouldn't like to say that Poland has always been right about Russia. But yes, for example, in the area of energy security, we have been prescient all along, and we were warning our partners in the European Union and NATO that Putin would might one day use gas as energy weapon, and he did eventually. But Poland was very well prepared for this scenario, unlike some other countries in Europe, because 6 years ago, we opened our first LNG terminal. A few months ago, we inaugurated the so-called Baltic Pipe, a gas pipeline which transfers gas from the Norwegian continental shelf via Denmark to the Polish stretch of the Baltic coast. And since October last year, we have been entirely independent of imports of Russian gas. Quite an achievement, I would say. It's been a painful lesson. Some of you may remember how frightened we were in Europe, thinking about the prospect of harsh winter and what that energy blackmail would mean for our livelihood at the peak of the winter season. Fortunately, the winter is pretty mild, climate change. And the gas storage facilities in Europe are full in 83%, which is also unprecedented. So now it turns out that it was possible to cut off those ties with Russia. So many political leaders were claiming in the past that Russia, maybe not a very democratic country, but it is a reliable gas supplier. It is a reliable commercial partner. It never was, actually. On the final note, a few words about Poland's priorities in the military sphere. We all believe that the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty is sacrosanct, and as President Biden has already said on numerous occasions, NATO is ready and willing to defend every inch of NATO territory. So are we. Poland has been perceived until recently as net recipient of collective security. Now we are transitioning to a new role of a net provider of security. We are ready, and we have stated it on multiple occasions. We are ready to defend not only Warsaw, not only Tallinn and Prague, but also Berlin, and also Paris, and also Helsinki, once Finland joins NATO. So also for us, it is a completely different configuration. And I think that also our American allies and some Western political leaders in Europe have finally understood how pivotal Poland is also in this particular respect of collective security. The only thing, we have all heard all those nuclear threats coming from the East, from the Kremlin, from some of those Russian propagandists so vocal about Russia being a nuclear superpower. But the only thing that Mr. Putin has actually nuked is Russia's reputation on the international stage. I'm not terribly optimistic about Russia's role in the future as a partner, because again, that notion of zero-sum diplomacy is so profoundly seared in the mentality that it will be very difficult to envision Russia again as a partner for the Western world. There was a glimmer of hope in the 90s. And then when Mr. Medvedev became president, rotating with Mr. Putin in 2008, I think one of his first visits was to the United States. He even met with Steve Jobs at the time. And he was, you know, you remember flashing the iPhone. And so many people, myself included, were hoping at the time that maybe that's the new face of Russia, that maybe Russia would be able to, for example, diversify its economy, that it would be no longer so reliant on gas and oil exports. Unfortunately, that hope never materialized. And if you ask me, firstly, how this war will end, and secondly, whether Russia will ultimately become a partner for us, I would always answer, it's $1 million question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you put that on? Yeah. And switch that on here. And then, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for some very interesting and enlightening answers to some of our questions, which we will undoubtedly pose again. The Polish perspective is, of course, highly interesting at the moment because Poland is playing such a crucial role in that war which Russia is fighting in Ukraine. The tanks have now been conceded. They will be, Germany will send Leopard tanks, other countries will as well, and the United States will send Abrams tanks. There's a lot of concern that it will lead to a brutal escalation, that particularly the people of Ukraine will suffer, even more infrastructure will be concerned, and maybe the war will even swap beyond Ukraine's borders. Are the Polish population, the Polish government, is the Polish population concerned about such a development?
I used to joke that the farther you live from Russia, the more concerned you are about a possible escalation. I'm confident we won't see any escalation in the foreseeable future, because if Putin had wanted to escalate, he would have done it months ago. And that's why, for example, I also don't believe in all those nuclear threats. I can't imagine more escalation in Ukraine. This is a horrible war, and the atrocities committed by Russian troops in Ukraine are absolutely unimaginable, abhorrent. So when we talk about escalation, it's pretty bizarre, because when the term escalation pops up in American or Western media, it usually applies to our side. We are afraid of our own measures, which could lead to escalation. But it's Putin who escalates. He has been escalating since February the 24th. He has adopted so many escalatory measures. Isn't targeting civilian infrastructure escalatory? Isn't bombing hospitals and kindergartens escalatory? It is. It's him who escalates. And I do believe that we also have to rethink the terminology. In this particular aspect, we are not escalating. We are just helping Ukrainians defend themselves. It's a completely different concept.
Well, there was a reason why there was so much hesitation to commit the tanks. So lots of politicians were thinking in terms of escalation. Of course, you're right. Putin.
And I mentioned that during one of my earlier meetings. By the way, I would never expect the Polish government to push Germany into sending German tanks to Russia again. But I think it was one of the reasons why Chancellor Scholz vacillated for such a long time, because it's not only about technicalities, it's not only about that fear of escalation, it's also about, in this case, the German mindset. And it's perfectly understandable that for Germany, it has always been, since the end of World War II, such an incredible moral burden. And I do understand Scholz, who wouldn't like to see German tanks fighting Russian tanks again in Ukraine. So quite sincerely, I was surprised by that decision, because I have always thought that it would be a red line for him in terms of Germany's foreign policy and Germany's, historical approach.
Would you say that Scholz actually had a success, because by waiting for quite some time, he now got the United States to commit Abrams tanks?
Yeah, we don't know exactly what the background was of those negotiations. I do believe that the Americans were pressuring a little bit.
The Poles, I take it.
Yeah, I do believe that the pressure on the part of the Polish government has also played a crucial role in this equation. But generally, the outcome, the final outcome, is very encouraging. And it also demonstrates, that in spite of all those vacillations, it is possible to hammer out a common position, even in such complicated matters. I don't know whether it will be a game changer. I'm not a military expert. I don't know whether, for example, Ukrainians need more the Leopard tanks than the Abrams. I don't know which one. I heard today that Leopards are better, and 2 days ago I heard that the Abrams are much better than the Leopards. But generally, it is a land war, and tanks are playing a crucial role in this kind of warfare, and it will be a protracted conflict. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about the swift end of the hostilities in Ukraine, but I do believe that those tanks will help Ukrainians be more efficient on the battleground.
Well, the Leopard tanks would be close by, and the spare parts would be in Poland or Germany or Finland, not that far away from Ukraine. What are the Western war aims? What do we want to achieve in the end? Do we want to get rid of Putin?
You probably want a diplomatic answer.
No. We are among ourselves as a very small group of people here, so we just want to have very frank answers, which are totally honest.
I'm convinced that in this case, political and military aims converge. Namely, I think that what West would like to see as the final outcome of this confrontation would be Ukraine returning to its borders, not before February the 24th, but before the annexation of Crimea, which is difficult, of course, even as a concept. And there is a dispute surrounding this particular issue, whether Ukrainians should be so determined to recapture Crimea, which is Ukrainian territory, and Poland has never recognized as an overwhelming majority of nations in the world have never recognized Crimea as Russian territory. But we are talking about Donbass, we are talking about Luhansk, we are talking about all those cities which have been occupied since the spring last year by Russian troops, and I think this is the main objective now of this military operation and also of all political efforts of Western countries.
There's one theory which says if Russia continues to be in charge of Crimea, Ukraine will never be able to live in peace. It will be economically difficult to survive. It can be blackmailed militarily, politically. Would you agree with that?
Yes, of course. And that's why I do think personally, but this is also the position of the Polish government, that Crimea should also be Ukrainian again. Well, the worst case scenario would be another frozen conflict. Also because, as we perfectly remember, after Russia invaded Georgia, one of the reasons was to deter Georgia from joining the European Union and NATO. So it's pretty obvious that Georgia would never join these two organizations, and especially NATO, having Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the hands of the Russian occupiers. So I think this is one of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine as well. And of course, he expected to seize Kiev in 72 hours. He was absolutely confident that this war would be a blitzkrieg. It wasn't, but it seems to be approaching a phase in which we would start talking about a frozen conflict. And as you know, frozen conflicts can last forever. That's a very perilous scenario.
What about Putin? Do we want to get rid of him?
Me, personally.
We, the Western world.
I'm not James Bond. if Russia wants to become democracy again, we have to allow Russians to elect their own leaders. And one of the worst things we could do now would be to demonstrate how determined we are to get rid of Putin. Because I remember the 90s and a very painful period in Russia's history, just after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, economic reforms implemented by the then finance minister, Mr. Yegor Gaida, Yeltsin, who was a drunkard, but he was our drunkard, as President Clinton used to say. By the way, the most democratic Russian leader we've ever seen in that country. But that period was particularly painful for the Russian society because of unemployment, because of inflation, inequality. And Russians remember very well that all those reforms were somehow imposed by Americans or by the West. Most advisors who so eagerly were flying to Moscow and in St. Petersburg at the time, most of them were Americans, American economists, American businessmen. So I wouldn't like to justify the Russian society today and how they assess that period. But quite clearly, it was not a very good idea to interfere, especially in economic affairs in Russia, because it left an indelible mark also in the Russian mentality today. So if anybody ventured into declaring our will to get rid of Putin, that would be absolutely insane in terms of our long-term vision and in terms of our long-term objectives. I personally would like Russia to become democratic again, more liberal, freedom of expression, free market economy. But again, Russia is still an enigma, and nobody knows what will happen in that country in a few years' time. There were some interesting precedents whenever Tsarist Russia, or Soviet Russia, entered a protracted conflict. It always eventually led to a change of regime in the Kremlin. It was in 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, then the First World War, then Afghanistan, for example. 9 years, 80, 89, and then a sudden collapse of the Soviet Union, even Zbigniew Brzezinski had not predicted. So again, it's so unpredictable. But the one thing I'm sure of is that we are witnessing another war in which Russia seems to be bogged down, stalled, both politically and militarily.
What you're saying is that the Russians should really do the job of getting rid of Putin. Let me ask you about peace talks. There's a lot of talk that it's about time for the two sides to get to the negotiating table. There are mediators, the Israeli government a little bit, and particularly the Turkish government and President Erdogan. How do you see that? Is the likelihood of peace?
My assumption is that that's why our American friends have decided to arm Ukraine as robustly as possible now, in order to allow the Ukrainians to repel and to push back the Russian forces in Ukraine as far as possible, and then in order to negotiate from the position of force. On the other hand, and I can only echo President Zelensky's words a few months ago when he said Ukraine is ready to negotiate, but not with Putin. It's quite a condition, isn't it? So I don't believe that that we'll see, full-scale peace talks between Russians and Ukrainians in the months to come. On the other hand, I was asked a question earlier today by one of your students about the diplomatic avenues. Why don't we try to explore diplomatic ways to put an end to this conflict? But, you know, whenever Russians sign something, an agreement, an accord, even a letter of intent, it's in 24 hours, it's worthless. I can't remember one instance in the past in which Russians kept their word in terms of international obligations. So it would be very risky to try to find a negotiated settlement with Russia and even force them to sign it, because that signature doesn't have much value, does it?
Thank you. But has the Western public in the United States, in Europe, the stamina to continue the war for another year, even 2 years, or the Ukrainian stamina? Can we really say that the West will continue supporting Ukraine? We saw divisions right now, which will quickly overcome, as you rightly said.
Especially here in America.
Yeah. And also in the House of Representatives, where there are dissenting voices who are quite strong. What do you think? Do you think the Western world will stick together to support Ukraine?
Again, it is a very painful lesson for all of us, and I think that nobody will dare say now that Russia is a reliable commercial partner, and we can return to normalcy in our political and commercial relations with that country, because we can't. Because it would be a stupidity to try to return that to business as usual with Russia today. So I think this is one of the arguments we can be using constantly in our debate about Russia's future. Another one, which is particularly interesting, I think that very few people realize how cheap it is for the West to deter the Russian aggression today. For example, the current American administration has spent about, if my memory doesn't fail me, about 4% of the military budget on this, the subsequent aid packages for Ukraine. It's peanuts. I mean, if we are not ready to spend this trifling amount of money in order to not to get rid of Putin, but to repel the Russian aggression and to deal with this existential threat, I think it's
you're right.
cheap.
I assume you're right, but that is not the perception of the public. They complain about inflation, energy crisis, budget deficits, including in the United States. So that perception is in the end what counts, not the official percentage number. And how do you counter that?
Because we live in a world in which domestic issues are, overshadow our geopolitical interests. So it's quite, I wouldn't say understandable, but it's normal in contemporary politics that in the run-up to the election, no matter what you think about, for example, this or that country's attitude towards Ukraine, you always focus on your political opponent, domestically, internally, and it's quite. For example, we can see now that the presidential campaign in the Czech Republic, in which there are two front runners, two candidates, Petro Pavel, a former retired general, and Andrej Babiš, the former prime minister of the Czech Republic. And just a few days ago, Babiš was asked during a televised duel between those two whether the Czech Republic would, under his presidency, whether the Czech Republic would come to the rescue of Poland if we were invaded by Russia. And his answer was very blurry, if not negative, only because he had to have a different opinion about that than his contender. And these are the usual constraints we have to cope with in domestic affairs. Mm-hmm. And there are some countries, and Poland is a superb example of a country in which there is widespread consensus on our attitude towards Ukraine, with some nuances, of course, with some shades of grey. Still, both the ruling coalition and the opposition have found some common ground when it comes to our policy or policies towards Ukraine.
Okay. When you look back to before the war, do you think the war could have been avoided? Where were the mistakes which also the Western world made because we stumbled in or allowed Putin to push us into that war?
The war actually began in March 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and I think that after that aggression, we were too lenient towards Russia. Of course, sanctions were imposed, but then lifted, and so many Western political leaders and so many representatives of business circles in some West European countries were so determined to eagerly return to normalcy in our relations with Russia. It was the original sin, I think, because Poland saw at the time what was brewing and how existential the threat was posed by Russia at the time. And of course, we didn't stop him at the time, and he returned with a vengeance.
Putin would say the original sin was the eastern expansion of NATO. What do you think about that?
As I said, you can now imagine if we hadn't joined NATO in 1999, we would have Russian tanks, I would say Soviet tanks, a Freudian slip. We would see Russian tanks in Warsaw today, and in Krakow, and in Poznan, and in Tallinn. And again, it was us who wanted to join NATO. It was not the Americans. On the contrary, there were so many misgivings in the American administration and among political leaders in Congress, journalists, pundits, saying we should not admit Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into NATO. And they were using the same arguments, that it would be too escalatory, that it would jangle some nerves in the Kremlin. But fortunately, we concluded that process, and now we feel a little bit safer, believe me.
Thank you. We open it up to questions from the audience in a minute, but just talk to me about Poland and the EU. At the moment, Poland is the darling, really. It's strong support for Ukraine, its acceptance of millions of Ukrainian refugees, which is rightly given Poland a lot of credit. But only a year ago, immigration was a serious problem. Refugees from Belarus into Poland were not
from Belarus.
Well, okay, but via Belarus, were not too welcome in Warsaw, and also there were constitutional problems, law and order problems, and the EU kept money away from being paid out to Poland. What is the situation now? How is that relationship with the EU Commission being rectified?
I will address that migration issue. Indeed, we had a problem more than a year ago, almost 2 years ago, at the Polish-Belarusian border, an operation orchestrated by Lukashenko himself and maybe even by Mr. Putin. They were transferring deliberately, physically, migrants from some Muslim and Arab countries, mostly from Iraq and from Afghanistan, offering them a rosy future in Europe, as long as they decide to cross the Polish border illegally. There is a distinct difference between that situation and our approach to the current crisis. Namely, an overwhelming majority of those migrants, again, transferred sometimes forcefully to the Polish-Belarusian border, wanted to cross that border illegally. Meanwhile, an overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian refugees were standing in queues or in lines at Polish checkpoints and border crossings. waiting for their turn to cross the Polish border legally. And they were offered all the help we could offer them at the time. If all those migrants from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and some other countries, well, also war-torn, had tried to cross the Polish border legally, and if they had applied legally for asylum, that would have been a completely different situation. You know, during the Chechen wars, there were two. In the 90s, Poland admitted 60,000 Chechen refugees. Poland alone. So if someone tells me today that our migration policy differs depending on what kind of religion is associated with refugees, it's not a very fair argument, believe me. We admitted 60,000 Muslim refugees from Chechnya, and many of them still live in Poland. Many of them are now Polish citizens. So again, comparing these two situations is simply preposterous, because they are not comparable. Now, talking about our role in the European Union, yes, we are a darling now. I thought we've always been, but and of course there are some disputes between Poland and the European Commission, not the European Union, and the European Commission, as is the case of many other countries, Greece, Italy, even Germany.
Not the same problems, though.
Not the same problem, not identical. But for example, there is that endless dispute about the reform of the Polish judiciary. And we have been using this argument also endlessly, that the systems that you can encounter in countries like Germany or Spain or Austria are even more politicized than in Poland. And it always somehow falls on deaf ears. And turns out that Germany is more entitled to implement this kind of reforms, and we are not. I'm not saying that all those measures that we have adopted in the meantime have been correct and justifiable. Because, for example, we are now trying to change legislation in order to accommodate the European Commission's requirements. So it means that we are flexible, and we can change our mind also in these under these controversial circumstances. But again, this is I just wanted to highlight a broader picture, because there is, and this is a very dangerous phenomenon. Poland is still overwhelmingly Europhile. As a nation, as a society, about, I think, 90% of Poles say they are satisfied that Poland is a member of the European Union, one of the highest marks among all EU member states. So, for example, it would be absolutely suicidal for a Polish politician to advocate for Poland's departure from the European Union, like was as in the case of Britain. Nobody does that in Poland, because you don't want to lose the support of 90% of your population.
Thank you.
Your voters.
Yeah, and particularly young people are very pro-European, are very pro-democracy in Poland as well.
But there will be a continuous tug of war between the Polish government and the European Commission. And believe me, it's not only about the current ruling coalition. If there is a change of government after the elections this autumn, do you believe there will be no conflicts whatsoever with the European Commission and a new liberal government in Poland? Believe me, there will be tensions, there will be frictions, because this is the very nature of the European Union.
Okay, thank you. Let's briefly go back for one question to the war in Ukraine, and then we open it up to questions. Question, how strong or how weak is Russia as a military power? Do you expect a Russian offensive and a Ukrainian offensive within the next few months? Or do you think that is just something we still don't know about?
I am not a fortune teller. I wish I were.
You have intelligence information from the very good Polish intelligence services.
Not much. Even if I had, I would.
You would
not.
let it know.
Well, firstly, before the war, we tended to overestimate the Russian military might. Now we tend to underestimate it. I believe that Russia can still, and that's why I'm not terribly optimistic about the course of the war in the coming months. Russia can still flood Ukraine with manpower, cannon fodder. Putin, quite wisely, did not draft young people at the beginning of the war from Moscow and from St. Petersburg, because he knew very well that body bags returning to major urban centers in Moscow would not affect his political standing in Russia very positively. On the contrary. But now the situation has changed, and of course, he will probably try to mobilize more people, hundreds of thousands of young lads, also from Moscow and from St. Petersburg, which will change a little bit his political image, I think, in Russia. Nevertheless, I believe that he still has the capacity and the resources to continue this war, but also, mentally and psychologically, he can't afford to lose this war. And until a few months ago, I think he was able to sell a military debacle in Ukraine as victory. Also because Russians have lived in an information bubble for so many years, so he can easily manipulate the public opinion in Russia. And there was a moment in which I thought that maybe Putin would justify his special military operation in Ukraine, saying that, okay, we have now defended our fellow countrymen in Luhansk and in Donetsk. They are now safe. Okay, the operation has concluded successfully. He didn't do it. If he had done it, he would have been able to withdraw not from Luhansk or from Donetsk, but from some other areas that he had occupied prior to that, and he would have maintained his clout in Russia, but he didn't do it. So he is so obsessed with this prospect of losing Ukraine that I'm afraid he will do whatever it takes to continue this war. The position and the attitude of Belarus is also of paramount importance, because if Lukashenko finally chooses to invade Ukraine, joining forces with Putin from the north, that would mean that he would easily cut off supply lines, and it would be much more difficult to provide weapons to Ukraine, and that would be a critical moment, I think, in this war.
But you're not afraid of nuclear or the use of nuclear weapons, no?
I'm not.
You think Putin would shrink back from that? Why?
Because again, it would be suicidal from his perspective. Well, what can he do? Will he nuke Washington? Say, then we would nuke him back.
At least some good news you have. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening, very informative. Let's open it up to questions from you, the audience. Let's take a few questions from the in-person audience here in the Mandela, and then we also go to our Zoom audience. Who would like to ask the first question, which is always daunting? Yes, this gentleman over there. Can you just wait for the microphone? Someone will rush to you.
First, Ambassador Magierowski, I'd like to say thank you for being here. But on to the question, as I'm sure you've seen, and I'm sure other people have seen, starting in the summer of last year, Lots of senior Russian officials have been floating sort of the outlandish idea that Poland has designs on perhaps, or not perhaps, but historically Polish regions in Western Ukraine. What do you make of these claims? Do you think that this is Russia projecting their sort of zero-sum diplomacy onto Poland? Is it a bizarre attempt to sow discord in NATO? And of course, you know, what can you say to sort of dispel these notions? So, thank you.
Well, to tell you frankly, I'm not used to commenting on such outlandish ideas, really. So, you know, one of the very few things Russians really excel at is propaganda. Believe me, I have never heard, when I heard that argument that Poland was, you know, even contemplating annexing some parts of Ukraine in case of Russia's victory in that country, it's so absurd. By the way, it's interesting to see if you had a closer look at the Polish political scene, there's not a single party, not even on the fringes of the Polish political spectrum, which would advocate for recapturing territory which had belonged to Poland before World War II. For us, it's a closed chapter, full period. So claiming that the current Polish government, with all the efforts we have made to help Ukraine, is now thinking about, you know, splitting up Ukraine and making a land grab. It's absolutely insane. So I do believe that there are, again, Russians are very good. And if you think that we are winning the battle of narratives, maybe in Europe and maybe in the United States, but believe me, in Africa and Latin America and some Asian countries, many people believe in that stuff. And I'm convinced that after Russia started using that argument a few months ago, many politicians and journalists and experts in Africa and Latin America have swallowed that kind of propaganda pretty eagerly. But, you know,
Thank you. Another question, please. Yes, the lady there, there's a long black hair. Yeah, in the middle. Yeah, a microphone is coming. Just wait a minute. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, because I think you said that you don't think the peace talks are going to be really effective. And I think you also said that you weren't like really sure if the tanks would be like a game changer. So I was wondering, what do you think that like the Western world should or even can do to like stop the war, or if the Western world is even able to like have a big influence in that way?
I love being caught delivering contradictory remarks. Yes, you're absolutely right. But I think that the question is, again, I vividly remember that comment made by President Zelensky that Ukraine is ready to negotiate with Russia, but not with Putin. So I think it's a precondition, actually. And again, I don't know whether the Russians themselves will get rid of their president. We had some precedents in the past, but it would be logical to see both sides negotiating, but of course not with Putin. Also because, you know, I can't imagine negotiating peace with a guy responsible for all those crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. It's like, you know, negotiating with Hitler in April 1945, after everything he had done to European Jews, for example. Because we already had knowledge at the time about the Holocaust. And we have even broader knowledge now about the genocide, and I'm using this term deliberately, about the genocide planned and committed by Russians in Ukraine. So I do not exclude that particular possibility of peace negotiations, but certainly in that case, we would have to see a regime change in the Kremlin. But again, I would like to stress it very clearly, it's up to the Russians to choose, to make the choice, whether they want to be still ruled by that genocidal ruler.
And the alternative would be to fight until Russia accepts defeat. Is that what you say?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Until Russia withdraws all its forces from all Ukrainian territory.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully that won't last as long as you indicated as well. Barbara, please.
Ambassador, I'm thinking about the optimism you expressed for Ukraine's path to EU membership and a rockier path to NATO, but not an impossible one. And then you're musing about how disastrous a frozen conflict would be. Does Russia win if this just ends up as a frozen conflict? Because what would be the ramifications for EU and NATO membership if we ended up with disputed territory in Ukraine?
It would be Russia's victory, definitely. Even if Russia withdraws its forces from parts of Ukrainian territory, not allowing Ukraine or preventing Ukraine from joining the European Union, that would be Russia's victory.
Thank you.
It's like it was Russia's victory preventing Georgia from joining NATO.
And you fear if something like that happened, which of course we don't hope, but if it happened, would that lead to the dissolution of NATO and the EU even?
You know, it's if you look at Turkey, which has been a candidate country for I don't know how many centuries now, but the membership itself is of paramount importance, but also the path and the steps and the measures and the reforms you have to undertake in order to be admitted into this exclusive club are also very important. And this is also our experience. Mm-hmm. Before we joined the European Union in 2004, we had to implement so many reforms in so many in various areas, in the judiciary, for example, and economy, corruption. By the way, Poland is one of the least corrupt countries now in Europe after so many years. Well, we are not without blemish, but there are some areas in which we are, you know, a leading beacon for many countries even more advanced than us democratically, because they have, not because they are more democratic now, because they have a longer democratic tradition. So it's important for Ukraine and for us to understand that not the membership, but the application itself is so crucial in this respect. So if Ukraine genuinely starts changing because of the need to adapt to EU regulations, EU requirements, EU acquis communautaire, that would be a very positive signal. And in 2000, the Maidan Revolution, in 2014, it began. Why? Because Ukraine was about to sign an accession agreement with the European Union. And that's why Putin reacted so harshly to that development. And it was, you know, light years from Ukraine becoming an official candidate country.
Thank you. Can we have a question from our Zoom audience? Can you read it aloud, please?
Yes, of course. First off, Ambassador, thank you for being here with us this evening. There's a lot of excitement in the Zoom chat, so thank you. Our first question is from Dave Sidor. He asked, besides Finland and Sweden, does Poland support the admission of more nations into NATO? For example, Georgia and Moldova?
I don't know, actually. I will try to answer that question more generally. Also, based on our experience, enlargement is good, generally. Because this is not only, we are talking not only about enlarging geographically or politically, we're also talking about enlarging the free world mentally. I believe that both Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine and many other countries, not their political elites, but societies and nations would like to join the West, not NATO or the European Union, the West. You can't even imagine how important that notion was when we were suffering under communist yoke during over more than 40 years after World War II. Our primary aspiration was to join the West, not NATO and the EU. Those were just symbols of our ambitions. We wanted to be a Western country, as democratic as France, as liberal economically as the United States, and as rich as Germany. It was our, not as, we didn't want to be a NATO member state. We wanted to be a Western country, adhering to Western values and benefiting from Western values. And I believe that if you asked an average Georgian, an average citizen of Moldova, what their aspirations are, sincerely, they would probably not answer, we would like to join NATO. We would like to be admitted into the European Union. They would answer, we would like to be a Western country. Because it has always been, like the Statue of Liberty, the West, liberty, freedom, prosperity, not, international organizations.
Thanks very much. Can we have another question from Zoom? Then we go back to the audience. Yeah.
Sure. We have a question from Joe Mosnier on Zoom. How quickly can enough of the battle tanks, mostly Leopard 2, be delivered to the front in Ukraine? And what is your view, Ambassador, of the threshold number of these tanks to provide Ukraine with a decisive advantage?
Okay, I have already assumed the role of a diplomat and a sociologist, now a military expert. Okay, I'm ready for that too. The question is, well, I don't know, firstly, when these tanks can be physically delivered to Ukraine. It will take a while, probably. The question is, how long are we ready as a Western community to supply Ukrainians with ammunition, fuel, proper training, because those crews have to be trained first in some military facilities in Poland, maybe in Germany, maybe in the UK. All these decisions have to be taken first. And also we have to be determined to continue this effort because it's not only about tanks. It's not only about hardware. It's also about, for example, spare parts, okay? Because you can have, I don't know how many tanks at your disposal, but if you don't have rounds, if you don't have shells, if you don't have spare parts, those tanks become useless. So, well, I don't know, it will probably take a few months to, to establish a proper foundation, if you will, for those tanks to be fully operational.
And the Ukrainians need to be trained to actually use them and drive them. Yeah, thank you very much. A question here, this gentleman.
So my question is about what you said earlier about Russia and Central Asia. So if Central Asia were hypothetically to decouple itself, as you said, from Russia, what areas of its economy, of its military in those respective countries still needs to be developed? And what country would assume the role of Central Asian countries' sort of primary ally, if not Russia?
China, of course.
It's also a question about the split up of Russia. Do you see that?
I think it's an implausible scenario. I don't think that Russia would disintegrate like the Soviet Union did in 1991. But you know, we didn't predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, so maybe this is a plausible scenario. Anyway, China would of course enter that niche and that vacuum, which would be inevitably created after Russia's departure from Central Asia. The question is whether those countries themselves want China to become their primary ally and their most important investor. China is already becoming an important investor in that part of the world, with all its upsides and downsides. But it would be very awkward for me to speak on behalf of those nations. But I believe that they would prefer China to Russia in that respect. There are many countries which do maintain good relations with some other countries in the region. Azerbaijan and Turkey, for example, very strong alliance, long-standing. China already has a robust economic and political footprint in Kazakhstan, for example. So many of these connections are based, for example, on cultural and linguistic proximity or affinity. So it's imaginable that Russia would have to withdraw from those countries, not only physically, but also, I mean, mentally, philosophically. But then there will be some other players who would, you know, who would be delighted to occupy that space left by Russia. But again, I do believe that it's important for the wider international security architecture to have Russia out of that particular region.
Thank you. Question here. Here, the gentleman there. Say yes.
Thanks, Ambassador. My question is not one too relevant now, but that was really relevant 2 months ago with the Russian or the perceived Russian missile that ended up landing in Polish territory, ended up killing 2 civilians inside the borders. There was obviously a lot of fears that Article 5 would be invoked. Article 4 was thought to be invoked too. I just want to know, what were some of the conversations in Polish foreign policy circles, and how credible were those fears that Article 5 would eventually be invoked if it was found to be a Russian missile?
If a Russian-made missile lands on your territory, it's quite obvious and natural that you react, that you freak out generally. So it was a very difficult moment also in my career, because I remember that particular evening. I was on the phone with the Polish Defense Ministry and with the National Security Advisor. And of course, initially, nobody knew actually what really happened. And but fortunately, it took just a few hours, I believe, that the president, our president, got the final report on that particular incident, which was a tragic event, of course, considering those 2 casualties. But I think it was also unprecedented, because it was the very first occurrence of this kind in NATO's history. So there is no protocol actually. There is protocol for a regular invasion and intentional attack of a third party against one of NATO member states, but not. What should we do if a Russian-made missile of unknown origin lands on your territory? And it was the very first question the Polish president and some other political leaders in Europe had to ask themselves. But I believe we passed the test, taking into consideration these very peculiar circumstances. And it was a crash course in coordination. Most NATO is a political and military organization, but most decisions taken by NATO member states and political leaders in those countries are of political nature and not of military nature. Fortunately, we don't need to take decisions of military nature in the NATO. But again, it was so, unprecedented, so unclear from the very beginning what we should do. And after the incident, I heard many expressions of appreciation or even admiration for how the Polish authorities behaved in that critical moment. It was difficult. Many people think that we are trigger happy, that we are ready to bomb the Kremlin immediately in retaliation. We didn't. And I think it was a wise decision. We did think about, on a more serious note, we did think about invoking Article 4, which would trigger consultations among NATO countries. But we finally, when we already had the whole picture, we backtracked from that demand. So there were no consultations. But again, it was a very good lesson. Lesson learned. So next time we are confronted with such an incident, with such an emergency, we will already know how to react.
Thank you. One more question from the, yeah, straight on. Yeah. Yes, please. Yep.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your insight, Mr. Ambassador. Earlier, you mentioned how the Polish government had extended many different legal, economic privileges to Ukrainian refugees in Poland, access to the medical system, schools, and likewise, Ukrainian government had extended similar privileges to Polish citizens for after the war. I think some of us here may be quite familiar with the concept of Intermarium or Międzymorze, as outlined by Piłsudski. Do you think that this war is driving Polish-Ukrainian relations in that direction? And is this potentially a unique opportunity or idea for a post-war security architecture for Eastern Europe?
You've got impeccable Polish accent. Are you Polish?
I was born in Poland, yes.
Okay. Międzymorze.
Thank
I
you.
just spell that. Międzymorze. Intermarium. Intermarium, or the so-called 3 Cs initiative, which is mostly an economic project born many years ago from a kind of a frustration of mostly Polish political elites and some business circles. Because if you look at the map of Europe, before the transition in 1989, for example, almost all transportation routes were from west to east, horizontal, connecting Berlin with Lisbon, Paris with Hamburg, and so on and so forth. And for so many years, it was much easier to ship merchandise from Hanover to Marseille or to Seville than from Tallinn to Warsaw, because of that, shameful lack of proper transportation routes in our part of Europe. So it was the initial idea to enhance networks, to build new roads, new highways, new railways, new seaports, in order to crank up, to give a boost to regional economies, post-communist economies in the 90s. Because it was one of the, well, as much as we tried to reform our countries, also economically, it was one of the things which was tremendously neglected for many years. And we wanted to redress that situation. And there is a coalition now of 12 countries which are deeply involved in that 3 Cs initiative. And we are progressing slowly but steadily. We have already, the American government has already pledged to invest, I believe, $1 billion in those projects which are now in the pipeline. So I think that, and of course it does cause some controversy among other European countries, because many political leaders in the West think that it is it's like, you know, driving a wedge inside the European Union, that we are trying to create a new format, a new structure within the European Union. But it is also a huge opportunity for Western companies to invest in long-term projects in a sector in which the prospects have always been rosy. I mean, if you build a motorway and an airport, a seaport, if you enhance the network of railways, it's always profitable.
Thank you. Let's take some from Zoom, and perhaps you can summarize a few questions because we are gradually running out of time.
We have a fascinating, we have a fascinating question from Scott Schwartz. He's curious about why haven't any of the oligarchs who have been hurt by the conflict, why haven't they applied more pressure on Putin to end the conflict?
Because they are in cahoots with the Russian president. And this is part and parcel of the political system in Russia. As I said over lunch earlier today, Putin does not care for the prosperity of his ordinary citizens. He does care for the prosperity of his cronies. And that's why, for example, it was so difficult for the Russian political elites for many decades to diversify the economy, because they didn't need to diversify the economy. It was sufficient to export, to sell gas and oil to Europe, to China, to India, to obtain revenues which would satisfy the needs of Mr. Putin himself, his family, and the oligarchs. That's it. That's enough. Why should we even think about developing high tech in Russia, about producing computers, about attracting even more foreign investors? We've got enough money, and our friends, our oligarchs, also do. That's part of the system, and that's why it's unimaginable to me that any of those oligarchs would now, reverse course, and they would try to topple Putin, because it's not in their interest.
Can you imagine that within the Russian military there might be great dissatisfaction?
That's a different story. That's a different story, because usually if it was not the military, but the FSB, the former KGB, those guys, I think that they would be, if need be, they would be ready to overthrow Putin. But it is also a very distant scenario. But if we even try to envision this eventuality, I think this is the only branch of political power in Russia which would be capable of that.
Thank you. One final Zoom question, please. Then perhaps a couple of final questions from the in-person audience. Yes.
Sure. There's another one from Zoom, from Scott Schwartz. If the war ends with a Ukrainian victory, in which Ukraine stays independent, what are your thoughts, Ambassador, about the prospects of the West contributing to the rebuilding of a post-war Ukraine? Do you think there's appetite for that in Poland, in the European Union, from the United States, for example?
Well, we are already actively thinking about Ukraine's reconstruction, no matter when that war ends, because it will eventually end, of course. It will require a humongous financial effort on the part of Europe, and I believe there will be a dispute about who should finance the reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy and who should benefit from it, to put it bluntly. And there will be some competition, of course, but I think we should not forget that the primary goal would be to reconstruct the European economy, the Ukrainian economy, which is now devastated. If we are talking about an economy, a country, the GDP of which will decrease by about 50% this year, this is absolutely, beyond the pale. I mean, it's hard to understand how you can live with those numbers. So again, it will take an enormous effort to, and also some coordination. Maybe it's more difficult than military coordination now.
Thank you. Yes, please, this gentleman.
Mr. Ambassador, so as many have argued, eventually Russia has to be reintegrated into the global economy and into international relations. As you mentioned earlier, the reason this attack happened is because of the lack of sanctions and keeping sanctions in place after the attack on Crimea in 2014. How do you combine and walk the fine line of integrating Russia into the global economy when that time comes, but also preventing a new attack?
Of course, it's a dilemma. To what extent you should punish not only the Russian leaders, but the Russian society for the war in Ukraine. And I myself have my own misgivings to what extent Russians themselves are responsible for all those atrocities. But if you look at the polls, I know many of them are not strictly reliable, but if you realize that between 60 and 80% of the Russian population supports this special military operation, so it's horrifying, and it's been, since Putin came to power in the year 2000, it's been more than 22 years of brainwashing and indoctrination. So, and again, they have lived for such a long time in an information bubble. So it's much easier to manipulate the public opinion. But still, I do believe that they do support that war, the Russian aggression. So it's one side of that coin. But of course, Russia is too big and too powerful economically in terms, for example, of its resources, not in terms of the economic growth and development, but resources, quite certainly. So it would be illogical not to think longer term about Russia's reintegration, into the global supply chain, for example. Okay, the bloodstream of the global economy. But on the other hand, it would be also unhealthy to lift sanctions now, because it would embolden other countries to do likewise, like China, for example. China is monitoring very closely the economic impact of those, 7 or 8 or 9 packages of sanctions adopted by the European Union and by the United States, or not only on Russia, but also on other countries and on the global economy. And I think this is one of the reasons China has reversed course a little bit over the last couple of weeks, because they now realize how detrimental those sanctions are, not only to China's economy, but to the global economy. What China needs to advance economically, but also politically, is stability. And the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chairman Xi's pet project, is now jeopardized because of lack of stability. For example, in Central Asia, Ukraine. This is when you think about Belt and Road, this is the belt and this is the road, exactly where all those conflicts now are brewing. I think the Chinese leaders are really concerned about long-term effects of the war in Ukraine and of the economic implications.
And she should have a quiet word with Putin, don't you think?
I hope so.
Let's have 2 final questions because there are so
Ambassador.
many. There's this
Ambassador.
Yeah, okay. First, yes, please. Randy, yes.
Hi. So if the war were to go on, and you said a long time, let's say, I'll take a long time, 7 to 10 years, who's going to wear out first?
Not Poland. Unfortunately, the Russian economy and the Russian society, they're very resilient. With all due respect, they can survive on cabbage and potatoes. They are much more resilient than Western Europe, for example. Before that winter, which was supposed to be very harsh and turned out to be very mild, it was hilarious to hear all those European politicians so concerned about the prospect of their constituents having to lower the temperatures in their swimming pools by 1 degree Celsius. How terrible.
Thank you.
How troubling. One more. So that resilience is, I think, one of the factors, one of the reasons Putin feels so confident about the cause of this war. But Ukrainians are equally resilient because they have also experienced communism. So it's hard to predict who will wear out first. But I do believe that with all that military aid we are now supplying the Ukrainians with, again, I don't feel entitled and authorized to predict that it will be a game changer. But if we demonstrate that stamina that you mentioned, it is possible that this war will be shorter and it will end with Ukraine's victory.
David, yes, David Litt.
I'm not sure it was
That's the
intended
mic.
for me, but
All right, then we have you. That's a very final question. Please go ahead.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the justification for Poland asking for war reparations now, more than 70 years after the war. It seems if there were better opportunities previously. Some commentators have said it's just political, but if you could comment on that.
Of course, all these questions are at least partially political, no doubt whatsoever about that. But also, it's a moral question, quite evidently. We have never received compensation for all the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany on Polish soil. We have not even received back artworks looted by Germans during the war. I know it is a thorny issue in our bilateral relationship, and I realize that it may create that perception of Poland as a country which just cannot get rid of all those historical grievances, that we are still wallowing in history. But as a matter of fact, the question of compensation, we are deliberately not using the word reparations, but compensation for what Nazi Germany did to us during the war is of fundamental importance. Also, not only in terms of our internal politics, but also in terms of our future relations. Germans have never paid reparations to Poland. Unfortunately, after the war, as you know, we are not making our political decisions autonomously. We were so dependent on Moscow, on the Soviet Union. So it was the Soviet Union which decided unilaterally that we should not, that the question was, sorted out. And that's why we, at least in the eyes of many historians, and at the time, we just gave up because we didn't need that compensation, which is not exactly true, of course, because we were not an independent country which could take independent decisions in this respect. It is a very complex issue, but again, if you think about countries which suffered most during the war, we lost the highest percentage of our population during the war, and we did not receive a dime for that, unlike some other countries in Europe, unlike Israel, for example. Without comparing the fate of Polish citizens during the war and Jews, because Jews were supposed to be exterminated, Poles were supposed to be enslaved. Nevertheless, that difference of approach of subsequent German governments towards Poland and towards other countries is, astounding. And that particular topic, it was like a ticking bomb, actually. This issue had to be raised, finally. And I'm glad that it has been raised. And I do believe that the German government, the current one, or another German government, will finally understand that this is important from our point of view, and that we should at least sit at a negotiating table and try to find a reasonable solution to this issue.
Thank you. This is a very complex topic. I think you should come back to discuss it in detail. Because I believe, if I'm not totally misinformed, the position of the German government is very, very different to what you have just told us. They would say, of course we paid compensation, lots of it, but we can't really go into it because we really, it's a complex.
If you allow me a conclusion, the position of your government on the Leopards was pretty different too, 2 weeks ago. And Chancellor Scholz abruptly changed his mind. So
this is a good point, but the issue about compensation or reparations, the whole issue of the Second World War is, of course, an ongoing debate for many, many months. That is unlikely that the German government will suddenly change its mind, but there is probably room for a compromise.
Exactly.
And as good diplomats,
This is what
that is what one should aspire to, that one creates a compromise. But before we do that, maybe over dinner, we'll have a question from David Litt, probably about something very different. Can we have a microphone here? There it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's return to diplomacy. We've agreed that this war will end, and often wars end when political calculations of the adversaries change. The war will have to end with some kind of political ending. You've talked about the diplomatic style of Putin, of zero-sum game, propaganda, etc. But there's another tool, as you know, others may not, in affecting political calculations of the outcome. And that is known as track 2 diplomacy, which is deliberately not formal. It's not official. It's not part of normal negotiations. It's done deliberately by non-official people in the dark, in the quiet, out of the limelight, whether it's between Palestinians and Israelis, Tamils and Sri Lankan majority, Americans and Iranians, to come to some understanding about what we need to do to come to political solutions. What do you think are the prospects for track 2 negotiations out of the limelight, not official, nothing to do with Putin perhaps, between Russians, influential Ukrainians in the months and even years ahead?
Firstly, I believe that the Russians would prefer to negotiate not with the Ukrainians, but with the Americans. Again, going back to my point about the concert of nations, they don't consider Ukrainians as legitimate partners for any kind of negotiations. And that's why, for example, when they were talking about a new security architecture in Europe, they turned to the Americans and not to NATO, to the European Union, or to individual countries. They are interested in negotiating a new architecture with the Americans. So I don't believe in a track 2 diplomacy with the Ukrainians, although I'm strongly convinced that we are already witnessing, without seeing it, but we are already witnessing this kind of diplomacy in the relation between Moscow and Washington. And I'm not talking solely about phone calls between General Milley and General Gerasimov, not very good friends, apparently, but still they talk with each other. And but again, I think that Putin has already crossed so many red lines. And at the beginning of the Cold War, that kind of negotiations was possible also because we were living in a different age of communication. Now we are living in a digital era, and firstly, it is very difficult to conceal this kind of communication. Secondly, it would be very risky politically to engage in clandestine negotiations with the current regime in Russia without exposing yourselves to media outrage. Okay, because Putin is a murderer. Putin is a dictator. Again, it would be like negotiating with Hitler in April 1945. Too many red lines crossed, too many atrocities committed in Ukraine. And if you're talking about contacts between American or Ukrainian officials with Russian officials, I don't believe that there is a group of Russian officials, oligarchs, advisors to Putin who would conduct this kind of negotiations without Putin knowing about them. And that would be the only avenue which we should contemplate. At this very moment, it is unimaginable to think about this kind of negotiations with Putin out of the picture. So for the time being, I don't think it's possible. But again, it's an unpredictable country.
Thank you. I'd like to close on a note of cheer. Is there anything you can tell us regarding hope and optimism?
We are Catholics. We believe in the afterlife. What else should I say?
What about the
Who can be more optimistic than belief in afterlife?
No, what about the good cooperation between Poland, Germany, and France within the EU?
I believe the European Union needs a new boost. And I think that this particular access that you have just mentioned is the right model to follow, especially with Poland rising now on the international stage. I'm not saying that we are now equals, but I do believe that we should rekindle this idea of the Weimar Triangle and very strict political and economic cooperation among our three countries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for a very enlightening and great talk. It's a pleasure to have you here. To everyone else, I'd like to mention that on the 28th of February, we have a Zoom event with General Ben Hodges about Ukraine and whether or not Crimea can be liberated. 28th of February via Zoom only. You're all more than welcome. And thank you again for a great performance tonight.